We're thrilled to be doing this today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Katie Shanahan-Linder. I'm the Executive Director here at the Center for European Studies. And we are totally thrilled to have, to be able to show you a very exciting and relevant film today, and to put you directly in touch with the filmmaker and to hear about his process and thoughts. Thank you so much for being with us today, Sam. I'm going to turn it right over to Chloe Gruesbeck, who's going to be moderating. She is a student in the TransAtlantic Masters program. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Chloe for a few years now. She was an undergraduate European Studies major, and I've been lucky enough to get to be her advisor. So originally from Grand Rapids, Michigan, but went to high school here in North Carolina, right, Chloe? As I said, she's a recent grad from UNC Chapel Hill in European Studies and Political Science. During her time here at UNC, she developed an avid interest in European immigrant integration and migration law. She had some great internships along the way, I can also say, and she started studying Arabic, which is really just fantastic. So great way to get even closer to the topic of migration. And she will be going next year, after her year at UNC in the TransAtlantic Masters program, she'll be going to the Humboldt University in Berlin to finish her second year. Chloe, we're so glad that you're moderating today. We're so proud of all your accomplishments, and thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you for that intro, Katie, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces here. I'm also excited this afternoon to be joined by Dominic Andrews and Dr. Dominic Newhouse to screen an episode of Samuel George's documentary Swing State, Florida, named after Michael. First, I'd like to introduce Dominic Andrews, who is originally from Concord, North Carolina, and earned his undergraduate degrees from UNC Chapel Hill in journalism and political science and a minor in environmental studies. He is also a 2020 TAM graduate, where he spent his second year at VU Amsterdam, and his research interests center around the role of public opinion and what it plays in shaping environmental policy and additional safeguarding against climate change. And also big congratulations to Dominic, because he is currently in the process of moving to DC to start his new role as a public affairs officer at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in DC. Next, I'd also like to welcome Dr. Dominic Newhouse, who is a professor of mine currently, and he is a visiting DAAD Professor of Political Science at UNC Chapel Hill and received his PhD from the University of Mannheim in Germany. He has a background in quantitative methods, and his research on European and German politics focuses on party politics, legislatures, and subnational politics. And like I said, Professor Newhouse currently teaches undergraduate European Studies and Political Science majors, as well as students in the TAM program. And finally, a big welcome and thank you to After Michael director Samuel George, who is originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and holds a master's degree in international economics from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in DC. Samuel initially joined the Bertelsmann Foundation in 2012 as a Latin American specialist, and is known for his multimedia approach to investigate critical issues in global economics with a special focus in emerging markets. Highlights of his work include the introduction of the Pacific Pumas concept, which relates to the advancements of opportunities of key countries in Latin America, as well as investigations into Brazil's economic malaise, Argentina's debt crisis, and Caribbean growth strategies. His studies have been cited in the Financial Times, The Economist, and the Washington Post, and he continues to work closely with the Global Economic Dynamics Project. And once again, a big thank you to Samuel for joining us, and I will send it over to you to introduce your documentary we are screening today.
Chloe, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be back with the TAM team and with the UNC European Studies program. The Bertelsmann Foundation, we are a nonprofit think tank organization based out of Washington, DC, and then we have our sister, or really parent organization in Germany and Europe. So we really think of ourselves as wanting to be part of that transatlantic conversation. So it's always great to work with the team there. So thank you very much. This is, we've had a number of collaborations, and it's something we definitely appreciate on our side. You know, I say think tank and I imagine some eyes glaze over, but we really try to do things in a new kind of way. We really try to do things in visual ways, whether it be infographics, documentaries. We really try to bring our stuff to life. We do a lot of stuff on democracy, on the impact of digital technology. So if you guys want to check us out, please do at bfna.org. I am really happy to be presenting the Swing State Florida, this episode after Michael. And I just want to give you a sense of what this project is. And I definitely look forward to talking with you about it afterwards. And this was born in the beginning of 2018 when we sat down as a team. Throughout that year, we had been doing a lot of documentaries about elections, about the Italian election, the Latvian election, Mexican election. And it's really it's one thing to do when you have an election to follow and you can get on the ground and follow candidates and talk to voters. And you have this very specific way to talk about democracy. We thought 2018 was a pivotal year for American democracy, but there wasn't an election. So we had to think of kind of a different way to talk about these things. And we thought there was so much misunderstanding going on out there, and we wanted to give people a chance to tell their own stories and to share their own perspectives and their motivations and their frustrations. And that's a fine idea, right? That's great, but it turns out we live in a really big country. And there was no way we could just get out there and meet everybody and talk to everybody. So ultimately, we decided we were going to investigate Florida. And we chose that for a number of reasons. For one thing, let's face it, people are interested in Florida. You know, it's a fascinating place. We also felt like, and you don't want to go too far with this, but I think you can say it, in some ways, it's kind of a microcosm of the United States. You know, many of the different communities that we observe across the country are present in Florida. You have a big migration community, you have a very rural community, you have urban communities. And then, of course, there's the massive political importance of Florida. And that seems to be growing by the day. I mean, I think Florida is going to be incredibly important and incredibly close in this upcoming election. So our goal was we wanted to kind of take the temperature of this pivotal state. And in the end, we produced a 3-part documentary series. The first part is called The Fields of Immokalee, and it's about agricultural workers in South Central Florida. And most of them are undocumented. And that was always kind of a bizarre place to start for our film, because if you want to talk about elections, why are we looking at people that can't and won't vote? And, our idea was migration has become this hot button issue. It drives so much of our political dialogue, and yet we felt like it was being discussed in a very dishonest way, whether on purpose. I think that, so sort of the tagline for all of these episodes is this is about communities that are used and abused to win elections. So we use them because you rely on their votes, or you vilify them in order to get votes. And the idea was, if we're going to talk about migration, and this is going to be what we vote on, let's just try to talk about it in an accurate way. Then the second episode that we did was called Liberty City, and that focused on the historic African-American neighborhood of Liberty City, Miami. This was once a segregated neighborhood, and now it's become under a lot of pressures of gentrification, of complicated relationships with police, of gun violence, and the inability of the community to pass gun legislation, even though they really want it. So that's sort of what we looked at, the rise of civil society in Liberty City, Miami. And both of those films are online. And so if you like what you see today, I definitely hope you have a chance to check out those as well. But today we're going to be looking at the third installment of the series, and that's called After Michael. And what happened in October of 2018, basically almost 2 years to the day from now. I think it hit October 15th. So this was almost 2 years ago now. A Category 5 hurricane slammed into the Florida Panhandle, which of course is that kind of stretch of Florida that curves west below Alabama. This was Hurricane Michael, and it started as this tropical storm and just kept growing and growing and growing. And it ended up slamming this part of the country that doesn't normally get hurricanes. And, that's one of the issues that we talk about in the film is we're seeing this increase of natural disasters, especially in areas that vote very red, like the Florida Panhandle. So that's something that we wonder, does this impact of climate change also potentially impact on how people vote? So this storm hits, and for us in Washington and for around the country, it was on the news for a couple of days and then everybody forgets about it. And I think that I kind of initially, you make the flawed assumption that, well, I guess that problem is solved because it was on the news every day and now I'm not hearing about it anymore. But the thing is, with these major storms, the storm is just the beginning. And as I saw over the next year filming on the ground after Michael, that was a long process that's still not over now for that community. And so I wanted to get to know this community because it's so important for how Florida votes. One thing that, and this may seem like common knowledge to some people, but I don't think it really was for me, that when we talk about swing states, in my mind, I always think of a bunch of undecided voters that, just wait to the last minute to decide what they're going to vote for. But what I saw on the ground in Florida is rather than this kind of undecided model, it was more that you had different communities that tend to vote a certain way, and the winner is whoever gets the bigger turnout. So you have Miami, which is probably, or especially let's say the Liberty City area, is going to vote very heavily Democratic. And then this Panhandle area is going to vote very heavily Republican, typically. And which one comes out more will often tip the selection one way or the other. So I thought by spending some time in this community, I could better understand what was motivating people there and why they would vote a certain way. And I the last thing I say before we get started, I took an approach that with this one that is a little bit subtle, and sometimes I regret that. And at the same time, I know why I did it. And that's what I did, a documentary in West Virginia in 2018. And I had these conversations with Trump voters that seemed to go nowhere for me, because I would say, well, sir or ma'am, why do you support President Trump? And then they would say something like, because he tells the truth. And I felt like that was the kind of conversation that didn't leave me a lot of room for a follow-up question, because my general understanding of President Trump is like he very rarely tells the truth. So I said, I don't want to just get to that immediate logger jam in the conversation where there's no more space to understand what's motivating people. So rather than asking, a nail on the head kind of question, I just want to understand what you're encountering on a daily basis, what your daily challenges are. So there's not many direct political conversations in this documentary, but the goal is to understand where a given community is coming from. And you can ultimately be the judge to think if that's meaningful for you, if you pull anything out of it. So with that, I just want to say I really appreciate you spending this time with the film, and I really look forward to engaging in a conversation afterwards.
Welcome back, everyone. I see people are starting to filter back in, and I already see a little bit of a discussion going on in the comments, which I like. We are now going to enter into our questions and answer portion of our panel with our experts and with director Samuel George. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will take them as they appear throughout the chat. And Sam, I have a question for you just to get us started off. I was doing a little bit of reading on your prior works and how your work has led you to lots of locations in Latin America and the Middle East. And I was just curious how you became initially interested in these three different communities within Florida and the Panhandle, like what, and if your prior work has had any influence on this specific project?
Right, that's a great question. So thank you, and thanks everybody for watching and coming back. Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to do was find, it's always tough because you don't want to say that people here in this place are the same as people there in that place. So I don't want to say that. I understand that different communities, even within a state, are of course very different. So with that caveat being set up front, I wanted to try to find things that I thought were applicable to other places in the United States of America. So for example, we just saw a rural Trump voting community. And I think you see that, and probably people with similar thought processes in different parts of the United States. Same with, agricultural migrant community, which was part one. Now, that's not to say, it's very important to say that this is not the only migrant experience. There are many, many migrant experiences in all sectors of society, documented, undocumented. So it's not to say this is the life of a migrant, but it is to say that certainly in North Carolina and South Carolina, and definitely on the Southwest coast and the West Coast, you do have this migrant experience that is a fundamental part of our value chain, our access to different produce and different foods that we eat. And even when it's not necessarily agriculture, but in the places where they prepare meat packaging plants. These are people that are very frequently of a migrant community. They become frontline workers in this COVID era, and you might find that kind of story repeating itself. And of course, in the urban areas. So, we've done work in urban Philadelphia and things like that. And you do see that same kind of tensions in the community as exists in Liberty City. I think what I tried to avoid is things that seem specific to Miami. So the example that I tend to give is there's a lot of Cubans in Miami. And they tend to vote more conservatively, I think, than than the average Latino population across the United States of America. And that's fine. But that's a story that's very specific to Florida due to its proximity to Cuba, and over the years, people migrating from Cuba to Florida. That's very unique to Florida. I think another community that we could have focused on, but we didn't, was the retiree community. There's a lot of older people in Florida that didn't grow up there or live there for a long time that then retire in Florida, and there's enough of them that it can very much swing the vote. But that's sort of a specific Florida story. So at the risk of making it sound like I'm boxing people in, which I don't want to do, I was trying to find stories that I thought were in some ways replicated across the US.
Very interesting. Thank you. Let's see if we have any more. Sarah, would you like to read your question I see in the chat?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to comment that, when you said at the beginning today that you want to tell the stories and your goal is to understand where a community is coming from, I just really appreciate the varied voices that we get to hear here and all these little details that come to the fore. And then some of the things, I already mentioned this in an email, but some of the things are almost prescient from what we're dealing with now. When the man who hauls away the debris is saying no one's doing recreational things, some people just can't cope with this, things are not like they were, and that's really echoing what we're living through today. And then that graduation scene where it's that you kept moving, here you are, you beat this, that's really kind of helpful to hear today. And so I guess my question really is, when you think about all the different people you were able to incorporate here and all the different voices from this small community, did anyone get left out? Was anyone on the editing floor that you wish had made it in, or you think, would have been irrelevant? I see outside of this small area why you narrowed it down, but yeah, what didn't get heard?
Series of comments that I'm hoping to make related to what we just watched, and you just asked a question that gives me the chance to speak to like most of them. So I really, really appreciate that comment. The first one, just about those little moments that you capture. I'm watching this now and just thinking about, sort of the uniqueness of the documentary field, that what you really try to do is become very intimate with people and get them to open up to you as they would a friend, to show you a side of their life and it's almost like you become friends. And then it's a weird thing because then you don't necessarily see them again. I mean, I haven't spoken to these people since I made the film, and maybe most of them, and maybe maybe I should be better about that. You know, maybe I should keep up with people better. But it's nice to see them again. And I'm thankful that we got to share these moments. And I think they appreciate the chance to tell their side of the story. And, you know, that you bring up some of this stuff, you know, when something major, when you have a game changer event like Corona, the first selfish fear, this is not the first fear, but the first selfish fear of somebody that's doing documentaries is that a game-changing event is going to make your film like no longer relevant. I'm not saying that's our key fear right now, but when you think about an old project, you're like, well, is what I did still relevant? And I really, when I watch these films, I completely agree with your point that it's not, it rather gives you, it puts you in their feet, and then imagine confronting this amazing challenge. I mean, you think of those kids, imagine a kid that was in 9th grade 2 years ago, starting high school, or how about yourselves? Imagine somebody as a freshman in college 2 years ago, and to just have their life flipped on its head, and then you painstakingly stagger back to your feet, and then you get hit with something like Corona. I mean, that's in a way, I think you start to understand why many Americans are willing to make these exotic political gambles. I mean, I think there's a lot of people out there that are really struggling. So I think it's good context for and that's what I always wanted to do with this, is build context. And the last thing I want to say, did anything get left out? There's something that was gnawing at me the whole time we were watching this. And I would say it's my only regret, really not even just, it's my only regret along these lines, not just with this episode, but the whole entire 3-part film. And that's that I did a scene in a rural hospital that had gotten completely washed out because of the storm. But then it was still the only hospital within hours and hours. So they had to open it back up, even though it was completely damaged. So you had these people, and it was 8 months after the storm, and they're still in this hospital that's falling on top of itself, and they're still serving patients because it's the only hospital for hours and hours and miles. And we cut that for time, and I wish it was still in there, because I think it gives you a sense, you know, if you see how bad, and again, across probably large swaths of rural America, the healthcare is almost non-existent. So when you start thinking about a virus like this going through these communities, a scene like that can give you a sense of how little they have in terms of healthcare options. So I wish I had left that scene in, but you make decisions like that, and most of them turn out to work completely fine. Of all the cuts, that's the only one that hurts me.
Thank you. I'd also like to provide an opportunity for both of our panelists to make some brief statements on their thoughts on the film. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Dominic Newhouse first.
Thank you. So let me just start by saying that, I mean, while I appreciate the opportunity to speak here, I don't like being introduced as an expert. You know, I just happen to be here, and that's a difference. I think there's 2 comments that I wanted to make, and one of them actually was very well made by Samuel, and that is the idea that swing states, you know, we think of swing states as these sort of, you know, states kind of on the tipping point, you know, they could go one way or another. But really what that does is to hide away the, you know, the very redness and the very blueness of some areas within these states. And I think this film does a wonderful job of, you know, showing us one of these communities that is really very heavily Republican, and sort of, you know, contrast that with the very Democratic leaning areas. And it's even explicitly mentioned in the film, where you know, one of the politicians is saying, we really have to make sure that, you know, we get the turnout so we can sort of counterbalance the Miami area. The second part, or the second point, small point that I wanted to make, and this is sort of, it's hard for me to make this point. Chloe knows this from my classes, that I don't like weighing in on American politics and American party politics specifically. You know, as somebody who's sort of looking in, I don't think it's my place to comment. At the same time, you know, I mean, what can I do? It's the movie we watched, so you know, I'll just say my thing, and then you know, you can sort of go against what I have to say on this. So I will say that as a political scientist, it was kind of hard to watch this. I didn't love the view, and it was very nicely done. So it's an amazing job, you know, sort of to show us these voices, and sort of they you know, make you question your sort of your assumptions and your beliefs, and specifically this view of politics that is widely shared apparently. I mean, of course, you know, as a documentarian, you sort of you give us certain voices and others you don't show, but at the same time, like this view of politics that it's all the same, it doesn't matter, you know, it was hard to watch for me. And specifically, like, I mean, even ignoring Trump, right? I mean, there's clear alternatives here, right? And, you know, you can think of small government, like you can be in favor of that or you cannot be in favor of that. But that really is what small government means, is sort of, you know, you don't have the capacities to do a lot of things. And so when, you know, when some of these comments are, well, you know, we didn't get any help and sort of government's not there. I mean, that is basically what it means to have a small government, right? But again, you know, I don't want to weigh in on this too deeply, and I'd be happy, you know, if somebody shares or disagrees with my thoughts. So thank you so much.
If you don't mind, can I just jump in on that? I definitely appreciate that input, and yes, I mean, that is definitely something I heard over and over again, and in some form of another, really in all three segments, you know, you hear this sort of detachment from it, and that's why it was so important for me to get the one line that's almost a throwaway line, like a joke, where Shelley is reading a meme from the internet. And it says, please don't let Trump say coffee is good because Democrats will ban it and then I'll die. That was so interesting to me because her reading of the battle of Trump versus Democrats, I don't think that was a pro-Trump comment or pro-Democrat, anti-Democrat comment. I think it was just an insight into the way she sees what's going on in Washington, that they're just debating over coffee. And if one of them says the sky's blue, the other side will, you know, put a bill in to say it's actually purple. So I completely agree with the comment that was made. And unfortunately, I see that in too many places in the US.
Dominic A., would you like to make a brief statement on the documentary?
Yes, and thanks again for having me. My biggest thing, and I think we touched on a lot of aspects that kind of involve the film itself, and the big things I actually took away were two kind of questions that I think were answered in kind of subtle ways that you mentioned, which I actually appreciate that, especially given the polarization now. It's really hard to get a lot out of people, but it's pretty easy to show, or I think it's a more easy medium to show how they're living, how they're affected. And so the very first question that's kind of tackled in this, and then a broader question is, who bears the costs of climate change, especially these hurricanes? And that's quite literally can mean whether it's a local, state, or federal level, who is paying for these things. And that's something that is touched upon within this community. They mention it. It's not deep, long discussions about it, but kind of this feeling of abandonment that no one either, there's a lot of mention at the county level, and then you look at some statewide and then federal level, and then also the human cost. So who's bearing human costs of these? And that's really shown here, the community level. And that's why I like these kind of digital forums to get out information like this, because a lot of times these policy issues are looked at kind of at a high level without really any regard to what's happening on the ground. And so it's always refreshing to see something like this in action. And then my second question, and this is something I've kind of dealt with more in North Carolina, which I think actually has a lot of parallels in terms of hurricanes, flooding, and how these communities deal with the effects. And so is kind of the issues of mitigation and adaptation. So you're looking at the big hot topic, especially for Democrats right now, is talking about how to curb emissions. But we have climate change here now, and it's going to continue to get worse, even if we hold levels to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And because of these changes, there has to be adaptation measures and measures to make these communities more resilient, and kind of this modernization of flood insurance and things like that. A lot of these aspects that are not necessarily the sexy issues in kind of figuring out climate change. And those are really big in North Carolina. And it seems very similar. We have a lot of problems with ongoing flooding. So you get repeat communities that are hit multiple times right as you rebuilt after you've waited years for these funds. And so kind of dealing with those issues, not as separate issues, but figuring out ways to kind of tackle both ends of the spectrum and figure out how to move from there. And so I think this is a really interesting documentary because it kind of puts it that's a really interesting aspect. So I think I cut out, but anyway, so that was a big thing. So I really did appreciate the subtle nature of that. You mentioned that at the beginning, and I actually enjoy that. I think it's refreshing to see something without this intense banter that sometimes is nonsensical. So
I really appreciate that. That's really what I'm trying to do. And I genuinely appreciate that it worked for you. No, and just that idea about climate change, it's kind of this, I don't know, I hate to make like a Game of Thrones kind of reference, but there's this whole thing where like we're battling each other on these sort of issues, and meanwhile there's this massive issue that's slowly creeping up and affecting almost everything. So in the Liberty City documentary, I told you it was a segregated African-American city, right? And so when they built this town for Black people in Miami in like the 19 Miami, but then what happens with away at the Miami beach? So suddenly that higher ground land that's further away from the ocean is rapidly it's a crazy irony that they were put up there to be far away from the beach, and now that's being pushed off it again. And that's this kind of subtle impact of climate change. And it's probably in the migration story too, because it affects the way you can grow crops in Central America and Mexico, which then affects migration patterns and where people are coming to in the United States. So it's this issue that like is going to have an increasingly major impact. Is my internet okay? Are you guys hearing me all right? I'm not sure if I'm cutting out. Oh, I'm sorry. That must be annoying.
Yes.
You did cut out a little bit about referencing the community you were speaking about at the first part of your comment.
Right. So did you get my Liberty City comment that we were just talking about how the migration, how climate change is an impact in almost every political issue we're facing now. And it's only going to increase. And I guess the more time we spend still trying to figure out if we agree that it's real or not, the bigger it's going to be when it becomes impossible to say that it's not. And that was something very interesting about the Brookings Institute research that shows that it's also really hitting the hardest in deeply Republican areas, which to me means two things. One is it could influence the way people could start taking it more seriously quicker. But the other alternative is if we continue to pretend it's not real, it's only going to get rapidly worse in those areas that are already vulnerable.
That actually addresses one of the questions I had when I was initially watching the film. We're about 2 weeks out from our presidential election. And I was just wondering if, while you were conducting these interviews in the Panhandle, were people aware, or was there acknowledgement of how this storm was a response to like rising ocean temperatures, or was it more just about focused on their community and rebuilding, or was there much talk of climate change within that community?
There was not. There was not. There was definitely people were able to acknowledge this never happened before. They all agreed on that this is not an area that frequently gets hit by storms. But, you know, when I would bring it up, most people would say, you know, what's Trump supposed to do? Stop a hurricane? You know, it didn't seem like a lot of dots were being connected on that part.
Thank you. Dominic Andrews, I know you conducted your thesis on economic policy, and I was wondering if you had any comments on this film and maybe multilateral actions within the United States and possibly with our partners in Europe for climate change, or any hopes you have for the near future on that topic.
If you don't mind repeating that, my thing cut out right when you were asking the question, or you can type it. It's kind of being in and out.
Yeah, of course, I can type it.
While she's doing that, I just want to say to everybody in the UNC community that, you know, I have so much respect for what you guys are all doing, getting through studies and teaching in these circumstances. I know it can't be easy. So I just want to give you thumbs up and all the encouragement, and you know, we're hoping that we can get back to normal.
I mean, I think
that's my little pep talk.
This event right here tells us that it's, you know, it's about time to get back to the real world. With the internet cutting out.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I heard
okay. Okay, great. I think it cut out right when you were asking your question. So you can ask it again, or I don't know if we moved on, but my thing is all out of sorts.
Yeah, of course. So I was just going to ask, as we saw in the film, in the Panhandle region after Hurricane Michael, and most recently with the forest fires in California, we're seeing the increased frequency of extreme weather events, leading to the displacement of people on a large scale, like we saw in Samuel George's film as well. And this is happening right now in very tangible ways, could have impacts on the coming election. So I was just asking, I know you conducted your thesis on economic policy. In what ways do you see multilateral action looking to address those issues right now? I know this event is also in partnership with the EU, who are economic policy leaders. And where do you see much area for improvement in that field as well?
Yeah, so I think that's, first off, a great question. It kind of goes back to my 2 points, the way I look at the issue in terms of kind of the mitigating side and then also the adaptation side. And so specifically living in the Netherlands last year, that is kind of a foregone conclusion. Water management is a top priority that's not really politicized in any way. And so it's interesting to see that. I mean, that's an interesting case study just because of their entire society kind of exists from reclaiming land from the ocean. And so it's kind of built into what it is to be Dutch. But I think in general, there has been more of a movement at the EU level in addressing this kind of mitigating factor as well. So looking at whether it's, you know, the more liberal system where they're implementing emissions trading schemes, things like that. And that is kind of a bigger way that they're looking at multilateral action kind of within the EU. And then when you look back at the US, there hasn't really been big efforts. There are some states that are doing things on that level. And it kind of breaks down to a lot of policies are actually implemented at the state level. I did some work on that last year in North Carolina, and there are a lot of state policies that can have massive impacts on mitigating climate change, and you can see that in some bigger states and more democratic states like California has taken more measures than per se. North Carolina actually was up there for a little bit with solar panels, and then we cut that recently. But there are issues you look at. I think that's the only way you can tackle the mitigating issue and reduce global emissions. You have to be multilateral. But then when you look at the adaptation side, that has to be all three levels of government in the U.S. specifically. You have to look, and also all around the world, but in order for these communities to survive and for us to actually save money in the long haul, you have to be building resilient infrastructure in the first place. You have to kind of battle with these questions of whether to move communities, things like that are really tough issues. But if you ignore that on the local and state level and just kind of try to do one size fits all federal policies, you can end up having a lot of backlash, or it doesn't actually get implemented. And so I think definitely on the mitigation side, you have to be multilateral. It has to be a global effort. But I think it's a really big challenge in terms of preparing communities or preparing for the future. Happens actually kind of at the subnational level in the US specifically, and some other decentralized countries.
Yes, thank you. That was a great answer, and I definitely learned a lot from that. I see that Kathleen Linder also has a question in the comments for us if she would like to ask it.
Sure, I'm typing furiously in here, lots of questions. So Dominic Nyhuis already addressed in the chat about voter apathy, and that really took me aback in the film. I mean, I know it's there, it's not surprising, of course, but it's so sad to me that that like there's no one to turn to. You know, there's just no one, there's no trust in sort of any kind of public service assistance, you know, and I'm not talking about, you know, nobody's talking about whether or not, you know, the SNAP program or food stamps, right? We're talking about people who have, you know, drastic devastation. It's not a question of someone's fault, right? I mean, this kind of whole issue. So I find it really, and I wonder, you know, how we deal with that, how we deal with voter apathy. And I'll go ahead and ask the rest of my questions all at once, so you don't have to come back to me. But I was also curious if Dominic, and if you could also talk a little bit about, you know, the difference you see in perspective in terms of voting in the first place, of trust in public institutions, and of course the belief in climate change and how that's, you know, playing a role in Germany and in the EU, as you know, Dominic A just mentioned, of course, the Dutch example. And then Sam, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the reception your films received. Also, so you can just tell us a little bit about how you're, you know, getting more famous by the day. But also, you know, this is important that these stories get out there. I think that I'd love to hear more about that. And for me, also, this was in Immokalee too. And you've touched on it today already, you know, that you become close to these people, but just how do you go about doing that, right? If you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And finally, I have a question from my 9-year-old who watched the film with me. He came in because, you know, break from homeschooling. And he wanted to know just how many people were on your team, which I thought was a really good question, actually, and how many people help you make the film happen. And he wanted to be sure that you were not there during Michael, but that you actually arrived in Florida later. So he wanted to make sure you was concerned of your safety. Anyway, thank you, Chloe, for letting me ask those questions.
Would you like me to jump in first, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate that you said your son. Yeah, that your 9-year-old son was is watching the film. First of all, that's awesome. That's awesome. You know, sometimes we wonder, well, what is the age group for these documentaries? And you know, hopefully for a perceptive young person, that's awesome that, you know, he could watch it and pick something up. And you can tell him that I was safe and that I was not there during Hurricane Michael. That was the one footage that we had to buy. We licensed some shots of the hurricane. If you want to know a secret, just between us. One of the shots is a big rainstorm outside of my window in Washington. Just one though. The one that is just all the rain and the tree blowing. I just shot that in slow motion. I got back. It was funny. I was in the Panhandle for a couple weeks waiting for a big storm to shoot, to try to cheat some film. And I didn't get it. And I came back home and I threw all my equipment on the ground and I just flopped back in bed and said, I'm home. And then all of a sudden this big rainstorm, and I was like, no, am I going to do this? I got to do it. So I got up and I shot it. And that one shot, it ended up, even though it's a cheat, it ended up working pretty well. In terms of the team, you know, I film by myself. I do it by myself, and then I write it, and then I sit with I write it in an editing program. So basically what I write is a very rough draft. And then I sit with an editor and we refine it together. And that's got its benefits and it's got its drawbacks. The drawbacks are obvious. I mean, this is not a job for one, just the sheer amount of stuff you have to carry and just to have in your mind. Not only when are you supposed to meet, but you know, what is all the settings on the camera, and you know, it's very, very difficult, but you also get maximum freedom, you know. And I have to say, Bertelsmann Foundation is really, really great about not asking me a lot of questions, you know. So I just kind of follow the flow and just try to do the best I can. But yeah, a lot of the time I'm kind of out there on an island, for better or for worse. The reception, I mean, I'm very happy. Obviously you'd love it if 100 billion, if the whole world sit down and watched it. But what makes me really happy is the people who are in the film like it. You know, my biggest fear is that I misrepresent somebody, especially because in all three of these cases, I'm filming outside of my community, whatever my quote unquote community is. I'm going in and telling somebody else's story. And my most prominent concern is, am I misrepresenting somebody's community? And you always have to be asking yourself, am I falling into stereotypes? Am I challenging the right places? And I'm very happy that everybody in the film has been very positive about it. So that's a good feeling. And then my favorite feedback is like what Dominic said, the people that get it. You know, I think some people are confused by it because they're so used to this partisan kind of diatribe, that whether it's coming from the left or the right, you know, this is going to be right up in your face with how you should think. And that doesn't mean that there's not some opinions. That I have opinions in there for sure, but I'm trying to work with you and give you something to come to your own conclusions. And that's my favorite kind of feedback. And so definitely I encourage people out there to check out the other two and to pass these around. And, you know, we've had to, just like you guys have certainly done, we've had to make a lot of different decisions about how we get things out. I mean, our model is to come do in theater screenings, you know, and come to schools. When we did Immokalee in February, we came to UNC and screened there. It was wonderful. We put it on a big projector, had a nice lunch afterwards. It was a very memorable experience. We can't do any of that right now, but it's great to be able to do stuff like this. And we've had a pretty good festival run lately. So, you know, that's always nice to get reception in the field, you know. So we've been accepted to a handful of festivals. So that's been really, really positive. But, you know, definitely by all means, watch them, share them. And if you want to talk about them with me, you know, if you want to complain about something or there's something you like, I'm here. And then the last thing that you asked, I mean, in some ways, that's the most important thing, is how do you get close to people? And I think what I've found is that people want to tell their stories. You know, we do think, human beings, we think more than we let on to. There actually is a lot going on up here, and we want to be good people, and we have this narrative in our mind, you know, especially, you know, people that are going through tough times. They want you to know. And I think the biggest barrier is the concern that you're going to misrepresent them or that you're trying to use them, because they're not, people know who they are. They know that I come in and say, hi, I'm coming from Washington and I have a camera. You know, their concern is he seeing me like some guy from the rural area that can't count to 10, and is he going to try to portray me like that? So my goal is to just be as straightforward and honest about what I want to do. And then, once you can get them to feel comfortable, a lot of people really take to it and they really enjoy it, and sometimes there's even this like kind of quasi Stockholm disease thing where at first some people who are very not sure they want to do it, after a couple times they'll be the ones calling me on the phone and say, hey, we're having an event, we don't see you, where are you coming, aren't you coming to film today, aren't you? And so that's always kind of funny to me. And I'll tell you what, I don't want to bore people, but there's a story in the Liberty City documentary. There's a group I spent time with called the Circle of Brotherhood, which is men trying to form a civil society community. And I went there, and we had this long conversation about who I was and what I was doing, where suddenly I was speaking to this big group of men with all sitting in a circle. It's quite literally the Circle of Brotherhood. And I gave them my spiel about what I wanted to do and this and that. And I said, all right, fine. So now we should be good to go. And then the leader of the Circle of Brotherhood, Lyle Muhammad, stands up at the end and says, okay, does anybody in the circle have a problem with Sam filming? And lo and behold, like 5 or 6 guys stood up and said, we have a problem. We don't want him to do, we're not comfortable with this. And I didn't see that coming from a mile away. I thought I had won them over. I thought we were ready to go. But, I remember what I did in that situation is I put the camera, I hadn't taken the camera out, but I didn't take it out. I accepted that, but I didn't leave. They didn't ask me to leave. I just stood there and hung out with them and watched their meeting in progress and hung out afterwards and talked to them and tried to say, I understand where you're coming from, and we, and in the end, it worked out great. And they let me do it, and they're thrilled with the outcome. So, yeah. But that was a shock. That I wasn't.
Thank you. I know, I'm not sure, we have about a minute left. Katie, I know you addressed part of your question to Dominic as well. I'm not sure, Dominic, if you still remember that or need refreshed on it.
No, I got the question. I mean, I can take a minute and then, basically, really, because it comes down to the fact that, I have your questions and I don't have any good answers, right? Like, I struggle with the same issues. I think one thing you do notice, and that is quite striking, is sort of there's a level of consensus on some issues that you just don't see in the US, right? When it comes to, the environment, or like right now with COVID, there's just much more of a consensus among the political mainstream. And really, there is issues that are just more politicized in the US. I will say, you do notice this effort to politicize these issues and sort of to take a position that's sort of a little away from the mainstream among the populist right wing, right? Those are the ones sort of trying to move away from this consensus in the mainstream. And that is basically, again, I don't like talking about American politics, but that's basically Trump, right? And you did say it, this lack of trust in the institutions, and that's being fostered greatly by Trump. That really is, such a huge problem and so damaging, and it's really bad. I do want to, one question that I keep asking myself: what is the sort of the underlying factor? What's driving sort of this politicization of some of these issues? And I think social media is certainly a problem, right? We've talked about that in the past, and that is a problem. One interesting thing, or one interesting point that I want to make, is that I've had my undergrads, they all had to write an essay on electoral systems, and specifically comparing sort of the European proportional system with the US system. And then, in addition to describing the features of the systems, I've had them, take a vote basically. So everyone had to, state their preferences. And I've had, no one in my class, and I don't know whether whether they're biased because of me, but they all were in favor of a multi-party proportional electoral system. And so a lot of the problems that I see, I mean, it's also due to the fact that there is a two-party system and this electoral system, which, it really does have its problems. And that's all I'll say about, again, American politics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dominic. I think that'll be, unfortunately, all we have time for today, but I wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists again for joining us, both the Dominics, and especially to Samuel and George for sharing your film with us. If anyone is interested in watching, there are 2 other episodes in this series on the Bertelsmann Foundation YouTube page that I encourage you to visit. But thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Really a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And just to everybody in the UNC community, just hang in there. We're all hoping to get out of this soon. And I hope to see you again in person for the next one.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sam, for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And thank you to Chloe for doing such a great job moderating.